In the late 1800s, women in the United States began going by the philosophy that they shouldn't be a product of what the world saw them as, but a product of their own choices. With men treating women like property at the time, this was near impossible. During the 19th century, the number of sane women being sent to mental facilities grew increasingly large. This was most likely due to the American ethos towards a woman's place in society at the time. They were viewed as property of men and were often degraded. Furthermore, divorce was unmentionable and highly frowned upon, so men often resorted to insane asylums like Blackwell's. Many women who were supposedly insane were committed under absurd grounds such as hysteria, imagination, or excessive novel reading. Immigrant women were occasionally institutionalized because they were misunderstood, and with no way to contest the false accusation, they were tossed into mental hospitals. Those who were falsely committed were commonly ignored when they tried to prove their sanity. Women that did truly have a serious mental illness, such as postpartum depression or anxiety, frequently received overly harsh treatments. The general society was living in a world based around male superiority. A young journalist, Nellie Bly, was brought up in a generation that also lived by the concept that men are senior to women. Nellie, however, did not agree with the mindset and was determined to make a change, even if she did so simply by writing newspaper articles. In September of 1887, Nellie Bly went undercover into Blackwell's lunatic asylum. This aspiring journalist exposed the horrendous ways the mentally ill were treated and aided in the beginning of reform for asylums. Bly also spurred dispute that introduced conflicted feelings on the subject of how the mentally ill should be cared for in our society. Nellie was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in 1864 and raised during the Gilded Age, meaning she witnessed a large amount of social and political corruption that came along with the issues of massive immigration, rapid industrialization, and urbanization. With this much corruption at the nation's doorstep, someone would have to expose it. These whistleblowers were called muckrakers, and although the prime muckraking era was during the 1900s, Nellie Bly was a pioneer in the undercover or stunt journalism movement. Elizabeth got her start at the Pittsburgh Dispatch in 1885, writing small articles, and it was here that she began to use her pen name, Nellie Bly. But in a desperate need for money, Elizabeth Jane Cochran needed a promotion. She ended up stumbling upon the New York World, where she bluffed her way to the top and got a job. Although Nellie's original proposal was shot down, John Cockrell, the New York World's editor, had a place for Bly. Nellie was given her first assignment with the New York World to go undercover into Blackwell's lunatic asylum disguised as a madwoman. But first they needed a plan, and Bly had an idea. In Nellie's own words,
"I knew if once I made a house full of women believe me crazy, that they would never rest until I was out of their reach in insecure quarters. From a directory, I selected the temporary home for females, number 84, 2nd Avenue.
Once into the temporary home, Bly began playing her part as a crazy woman. The journalist's acting seemed to be working, and the women in her boarding house noticed. The landlady called the police to report Bly's strange behavior, and to Nellie's delight, she got sent to New York's Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. This brought her one step closer to being committed into Blackwell's. Doctors at Bellevue ruled out physical causes for Bly's odd behavior and concluded that she was insane. They ordered that Nellie be taken to Blackwell's lunatic asylum. Even before Bly was introduced to Blackwell's doctors, she witnessed false accusations of insanity among other patients. Once with doctors, Bly went as Nellie Brown from Cuba. During her examination in Blackwell's, Nellie made no attempt to continue her act of insanity. Later, Bly said,
Yet strange to say, the more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be."
The doctor carelessly pronounced her insane, and Bly would go on to see and experience the horrific abuses that were of Blackwell's. She observed that inmates were often served rotten food and had to endure severely cold baths, and the heating pipes never seemed to be in use. Nellie wrote that she frequently heard nurses make threats and verbally abuse patients. Nurses didn't allow patients to take part in any activities that might stimulate the mind, like simply reading a book. Bly also saw nurses slap and twist fingers of many patients.
They wouldn't, and in some, they really really didn't understand, like, things like electroshock therapy when that started evolving, and things like water cures, and all of that at the time was just starting to get grounding as science, so they wouldn't necessarily know that their family members were potentially enduring these things, but they also didn't necessarily care. You really have to understand at that time period mortality rates, like even with children, you might have 6 children or 6 pregnancies. 50% of those children would never live to adulthood, just for the mortality rates at the time. So relationships were more, I would say, fickle than they are today.
Bly said that Blackwell's asylum didn't seem to be a hospital at all, but a prison to lock away unwanted people, a place to put people that nobody knew what to do with, and it was a way to shut them out. Citizens often kept it a secret when relatives were pronounced insane, for it was a huge embarrassment to be associated with mental illness. 10 days after entering the asylum, Bly was removed by an attorney from the New York World and was set free from the horrid conditions and treatments that were hidden within Blackwell's lunatic asylum. Bly left the asylum, but she wasn't done yet. She wanted to help all of the other women in the asylum who had no way to get out of the trap that was Blackwell's. On October 9, 1887, Bly finally had the first 2 segments describing her experiences at Blackwell's published, and many people were shocked to learn all of the hidden abuses and treatments in the asylum. It was assumed that apparent insane or ex-inmates' allegations were not to be trusted, and the conditions seemed to be completely normal to the outside world. Due to the startling article, copies were spreading and being snatched up quickly. Bly's story seemed to be a huge success. After her very successful articles on Blackwell's, the New York World took her on full-time. Bly's editor brought back her original proposal to travel around the world in less than 80 days, but there was a catch. Nellie wouldn't make the trip, a man would. This was because of the stereotype that a woman would bring too much luggage and not succeed in their task. Nellie challenged the idea, claiming that if they sent a man, she would do the same route and return with more time to spare. Having worked with Bly before, her editor believed Nellie and gave her the assignment. Nellie Bly continued to have a successful journalism career and destroyed many stereotypes along the way.
To understand that conflict at the time, the conflict that Nellie Bly really exposed, because people would be institutionalized, but no one would understand their experience, because they would go there and essentially be forgotten about. So aside from the people who kind of built the system and worked in the system, which of course they wouldn't have any incentive to be a whistleblower per se, because that was how they made their livelihood. So Nellie Bly, inserts herself and exposes something that people really didn't understand was happening. And of course that provokes compromise, that makes a change, that makes people take a look at something, and even if it doesn't happen quickly, it makes people take a fresh look at it and say, oh, I didn't understand that was happening. But also, again, understanding the context of the time.
She continued making great social strides in multiple mindsets. Nellie brought awareness to the issue of caring for the mentally ill. This allowed changes to be made. 7 years after Nellie's departure from the dreaded Blackwell's Island, the asylum closed its doors for good. Currently, Blackwell's Island is known as Roosevelt Island and houses the Cornell University of Technology campus. Bly also changed the nation's idea on crazy. State hospitals were established to reduce the amount of large corrupted asylums like Blackwell's. These state hospitals absorbed patients, and many of them no longer resided in jails or insane asylums. With smaller and safer hospitals for the mentally ill, relatives could visit. Evolving names given to the asylums over time brought realization to how they were perceived in society. These names shifted from lunatic asylums to centers of hope or mental wellness. Nellie's contributions eventually brought understanding that insane people shouldn't be shut out and neglected, but cared for.